Hello, my name is Payson, and you're watching Galactic Reviews, and you're watching Disney Channel. Yeah. Welcome back to Galactic Reviews. My name is Payson. If you were to go ask people about any family-friendly films that have had notoriety or have stood the test of time, you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody that wouldn't mention a Pixar film, like Toy Story, Up, Cars, early Pixar films. And while they've had some rough films, which have happened more so in recent years, they've still had relatively family-favored films that have made the studio what it is. And even though Pixar is falling prey to what its parent company is doing, as far as going into the atrociously horrible film practice of being political in a film where it's not needed or never was needed. And as Pixar Studio in and of itself is starting to fall prey to its parent company Disney, you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody that would actually have a problem with some of the older Pixar films, as they were just full of fun and enjoyment for any age of family member. However, that is not the case with this article from Screen Rant that has decided to say there are 10 harsh realities of going back and watching older Pixar film. So I'll leave a link for this article in the description below, but let's go on. Now, they tried to cover themselves up a little bit by saying, like, though many are undeniable classics, and then they're going to go critique them as to why you should either not watch these or why you should at least brace yourself for the torturous terror that these films have in it. And then it talks about it's shilling up here for the new Pixar movie Elemental, which I don't know, really hasn't gotten. I've seen the trailer for it. Really hasn't gotten anybody excited from what I can tell, besides shills like Screen Rant for Disney. It starts out here. The first paragraph is mostly them just glorifying Elemental and how great and phenomenal it looks. Even though not much about the plot is known and not much about the movie has been shown, they're going in and shilling for it anyway. And knowing Disney, most people would be skeptical by now still. However, it starts out here with its criticisms. At the same time, anyone who has spent any time rewatching the various Pixar movies in the catalog knows that they are far from perfect. I would agree with that statement, as not all of them are perfect, but a lot of them are good enough or are great and spectacular, and about as perfect as it could ever get. It starts out here on the second sentence. Indeed, revisiting many of these means acknowledging some of the harsh realities attendant upon these particular animation studio and its very prodigious output. Now, this is more so a critique. From what I can best tell, this is more so a critique on the studio than on the movies, because it hops from movie to movie to movie and not really ever giving like any specifics on it. So as a studio, earlier they were praising the studio for having kind of been reformed through Disney, and they're going back and critiquing all the old stuff from Disney. What I've noticed is, in articles like these where they have like a list, do you want to start off with a big point, end with a big point, and kind of have some decent or filler points in between? Or they probably would have filler and this is very much the case, or they think this is very much the case because they think this is a very strong point. There aren't enough important female characters. That's an outright lie. In Up, you had Ellie, which basically is the catalyst for Carl going to Paradise Falls. You have the Princess Queen in Bug's Life, as well as Dot, who is essentially the reason for why Flick comes back. You have Sally in Cars, which is one of the main reasons as to why Lightning McQueen kind of puts down his ego and becomes a better, I wouldn't say better person, but better car, I guess. You have Bo Peep in Toy Story 1 and 2. You have Jessie in Toy Story 2 and 3. And I could keep on going down and down the list. What they're saying here, in their main point of this, is in the second sentence where they say they're not female leads, and because that seems to be the problem. However, they say that one of the most glaring problems with Pixar is its lack of strong female characters. Now, I would argue with that sentence because, as I've listed earlier, there are a whole bunch of strong female characters in many Pixar films, in almost every Pixar film, actually. And the only times they point at strong female leads is ones in which females are leading them. However, that'll be important that they only point to Brave and Inside Out later on in the article. And they kind of compare Pixar to Disney, and they blame, and it's a whole bunch of political SJW nonsense in which they say, whatever its flaws, Disney has had at least some women in its roster of characters. And I would say that's the same thing for Pixar, so I don't know why. It seems like this is the only point that they have is that it's not a female-led movie. And they only point to 2 examples of female-led movies. It's a poor point, not a good point. Early animation has aged poorly. That actually would be a decent argument for Toy Story. Most of the other ones have done fairly well. I would say Toy Story would still hold up relatively well, as they particularly didn't do many human characters because they looked kind of plastic-ish and didn't look like humans at all. Hence why you don't get to see Andy's dad. That was their explanation for that. So, I mean, you kind of argue that. However, the movie on its merits and on its storytelling, on its character growth, on its overall universal love for this movie kind of transcends that early animation that has somewhat aged poorly. And they kind of bring in here that unlike traditional 2D animation, which 2D, which tends to transcend time periods, and they point to Snow White, for example, since it was made in the 1930s, this isn't simply the case with CGI. However, if I remember correctly, there was all kinds of DVDs that would come out from Disney that would say everything was digitally remastered in order to make it kind of age better with the times. However, this is saying that one can still appreciate the Snow White made in the 1930s. So they kind of like they kind of like hit themselves in the foot here, if that makes sense. It's not quite the same thing. If we're comparing it to all the stuff that was made back when this was, if we're comparing all the CGI movies that were made back in the time that this was made, this transcended well beyond what was made in 1995 as far as CGI. This is also not really a good point and can also be chalked up to the story is so well beloved and the characters are so well beloved that it transcends, that alone helps it transcend time. But that would be mainly the only point. However, you would want studios to get better as they age, and I don't know. I don't think this is a harsh reality for the studio. If anything, this is a show of growth, if anything, of how good their CGI and how good they've gotten with animation. And looking at where they started from, they were good then, so they've gotten even better now. So it's an odd one because you don't know whether or not they're critiquing the movies or the studio, and it kind of switches in between. Like the first one was obviously a critique on the studio. The second one was mostly a critique on a movie in and of itself because it doesn't apply to the rest. This one's also a critique on the studio, where they can be emotionally devastating. And you would want them to somewhat have some emotion to it, as it would involve the audience, get the audience somewhat caring about these characters and understanding. Like they point up as like 10 minutes of emotional stress, and okay, but it helps you in understanding Carl, his whole reasoning for wanting to go to Paradise Falls. You get to understand his character, why his character acts the way it acts. I've heard this quote from, I believe it was from Brian Henson, or somebody else saying it was a quote from Brian Henson, if I'm mistaken, but he said something along the lines of, You have to show the darkest places before you can ever see the light. Before you can ever get to really care that much about the light. Like, you're not gonna, like, you gotta see some of the you gotta see some of the lowest valleys before you really appreciate the highest peaks that this movie will go. And it pays off because you care so much about Carl and Up. You care so much about what he's going to do, and then later on when he has to let go of Ellie in order to go save Russell and Kevin and them, you actually get the feel for the character. So it's one of those things where it's needed. You might cry, you might have you feel like your emotions were violated apparently, but it's needed in order for you to understand the characters to some extent and understand their flaws as well as their actions. And it's needed in order for you to appreciate the highs that the movie ends up going to. Sometimes their stories don't make any sense, and this seems to only apply to Cars 2. Cars 2 does make sense if you understand that it is a James Bond kind of spoof with just the Cars characters kind of in it. And it still does kind of make a story about Lightning McQueen and stuff, so it kind of still has the Cars element in it. But it's also got the whole James Bond kind of spoof with Mater going on that's taking the forefront, while the racing stuff that would happen in Cars has kind of gone in the background. It's a fun one. And if you go back and watch it, it helps expand the Cars universe in ways that Cars 1 never needed to, and ways the first Cars never really could. And it's a whole bunch of just mindless fun. If you're going into it expecting Cars, then you're going to be the same exact movie as Cars, or to some extent Cars, then you're going to be fairly disappointed. And they chopped this up as a studio that is very good with coming up with great concepts, but having a bad idea or having a bad way to have that story make any coherent sense. And I would disagree. Everybody has their opinion. It's not the greatest thing since sliced bread. However, still a well done movie, well done animated, well done cast, well done score. Most of the stuff was thought out from what I can remember. It's a good turn your brain off, kids watch movie. Heck, it's even got character names like James Bond, like Holly Shiftwell. Think about it that way. I'm pretty sure that made adults laugh to some extent. This one also comes into play. They say sometimes the sequels and prequels are too predictable. Now, I'm assuming they're trying to talk about all of them, from what I can understand. Like Monsters University, Toy Story 2 and 3, Finding Dory. Now, this is the problem that you have with the first one. They don't mention Finding Dory in the one that has strong female leads. So I don't know what exactly that entails. Apparently Dory's not a female. So apparently Dory's been a dude the whole time. Apparently the sequels and prequels are too predictable. However, they just complained about Cars 2 up here with their stories not making sense. Cars 2 was not predictable. You did not know where that thing was going. Especially if you're complaining about it not being like Cars. Or not having the same focus that Cars did. Now, the sequels and prequels are somewhat, especially if it's the prequel, Monsters University, it's somewhat predictable in how it's going to end up. They still did a good job of having the characters still remain the same characters while making the story somewhat still be reminiscent of the first one, but have it be on its own thing without completely relying on the original movie to make the sequel or prequel its own standoff thing. And that's something that Pixar's done way better than Disney, as Disney's done a whole bunch of straight-to-DVD sequels and prequels in some instances, whereas Pixar has done decently well sequels and prequels to the point where, like in Toy Story 2, the sequel, in some cases, in some people's minds, outpassed the original. So I guess they are, I guess you could say they're sometimes predictable to some extent. However, most movies are to some extent predictable. And especially if you watched it so many times, yeah, they're predictable. Especially nowadays when everybody's trying to copy the same formula as Pixar has been doing. You can understand why they are predictable, because they were copying these guys. So it makes a little bit more sense when you put it in that perspective. They complain about not enough world building, and they point to Cars. However, Cars 2 has a whole bunch of world building. And it could be argued that Cars really didn't need the world building. The world building that did occur was the world building that was needed in the story, And there was a whole bunch of extra world building in Cars 2 that really wasn't needed at all in the story. But it still happened. In Cars 2, you felt like you were part of a bigger world. And that was more eye-opening for Mater, as we were focusing on Mater, who had mainly been staying in a small town. And that makes sense, because it's putting him out of his norm. Lightning McQueen has been the exact opposite. He had been in the world, and now he was in a smaller town, hence why it goes from really big world about racing and stuff to like singling into a small town named Radiator Springs. And it makes sense for the movie. So it's odd that they're only picking those specific ones in which it's needed either it was necessary for the movie to have as much of an impact, or in order for it to be relevant into what their point is. There are too many chase sequences, and quite honestly, it's a family movie. You want to get kids to stay in the seat, you got to have some action, because they're not just going to sit there and listen to people talk. They do that all the time anyway. And a lot of, especially boys, they don't like doing that. So they don't like sitting and listening to people talk. So the reason why there are chase sequences in there, I don't think there are far too many. In fact, I think they've kind of hit the right kind of thing where there are enough to get kids somewhat involved throughout the story. And they kind of point to WALL-E, but they also point to like Toy Story, which I don't think Toy Story really has that many chase sequences in it. If I can recall, the only one I can think of is when Buzz and Woody are on the remote control car and they're trying to get back into the moving van. Yeah, I think that is a poor point that is made, and one that really... Other points I could see that some of the other ones, like the CGI one, I could see that they had some merit to it. This one really doesn't have any. The plots can be repetitive to some extent. That's always going to be the case in a sequel. However, that isn't the case with Cars 2. They mainly point to movies like Toy Story and then Finding Dory. And I think this only seems to apply to sequels and prequels as well, which could have just been... It's the same thing as the other point above, but it's like I said earlier, they try to make the characters the same while also and having the reminiscence of the first film while making it still its own thing and still having the characters act in a way that you would find somewhat still without it seeming alien. The best way I can point at that, it would be Toy Story 4, in which most of the characters, mainly Buzz and Woody, who have been like the main two for all the Toy Story films, act almost alien in that film. So, especially Buzz. There are too many climaxes, ladies. Complains about movies having a central climax, and this seems to be more so a problem with the newer films, as it points to seems like I would think they would point to an older film as far as like having definitive central, more than one climax in the film. However, it points to Finding Dory. I would argue that's not the case. They point to Dory finally reuniting with her parents, only for Martin and Nemo to needing to be rescued. Well, considering that that's played off as a laugh, I would assume that that's just the final resolution. Like, this is the ultimate this is like the definitive central sort of thing that definitive moment in the movie is when Dory does find her parents. However, the stuff that happens with Nemo and Marlin, it's just the aftermath. I would say sort of like an epilogue sort of thing, or like the aftermath of like the repercussions of what she's had to go do to find her parents. If that makes sense. All makes sense. This is probably the main definitive. Like, there are definitive ones, but there are like mini ones as well. But there is a main definitive, that which is usually structured. Now, it does complain that there are too many of these, and to some extent I would say, okay, maybe, but you have to be more specific, as the one that you point at in Finding Dory is like, yes, that's the definitive, but you got to have also the aftermath of, because you can't just be like, oh yeah, everything's happy and go lucky. No, there's also some stuff that you got to clarify first, because now you got to be like, well, how is everybody going to get out of the situation and whatnot? So it's not a very good point. They don't usually have great villains, and the one that they can point at is Otto. However, this is the one that is I would say is actually the weakest, because they have very good villains. Chef Skinner in Ratatouille. The old guy, Carl Muntz, I believe is his name, in Up. They have Syndrome, one of the most famous and more well-beloved Pixar villains. Let's see, they got Hopper from Bug's Life, Sid from Toy Story, Prospector Pete Lotso from the Toy Story franchise as well. They've got a lot of remarkable villains that have been a great. And Otto, I would say, is more so an anti-villain than a straight-up villain, as he is you understand his reasoning for why he's doing stuff, but you've also been able to see other robots fight the programming. So this is kind of a weird thing to point at, because they kind of point to that Otto is just simply following programming. Well, as we've seen with Wally and Eve, that they've kind of been able to either fight their programming, argue against their programming, find a way around their programming to some extent, as that's how the movie undergoes. Wally is an interesting character, as he's not quite doing his programming, or he's kind of doing his programming, but he's playing around with human stuff, which I don't think is a part of his programming. So either it's just Wally that has that, or it's something that is instilled in all these artificial intelligence, sort of robotic beings that could have been done, as Mo also does. Even though he is like trying to follow his programming of cleaning up the place, he does end up saving Wally and Eve from, or helping save Wally and Eve from being blown out the airlock. And the giant wall, I think they're called Wallets, once they do see that there is a problem, and noticing that Wally and Eve are outside in the airlock along with Mo, who's kind of helping them stay there, they do let them back in. So this isn't something that is just central. This is not accurate at all, to the point where, and most of these aren't. Some of these probably could be argued against, or for or against, but some of these there's no, it's like one instance, one movie that they point to in which it's like an outlier, if that makes sense. So I don't know. I could be totally off my bonkers on this one, or I could be completely right. I have no idea. I think I'm right, but if you think I'm wrong, please let me know in the comment section down below. If you'd like to see more of these where I talk over a Screen Rant article or some other article that has like a 10 list series of why you should not watch this movie, show, sort of thing, or why you should, let me know down in the comment section below, as there are a whole bunch of 10 harsh realities of rewatching something on Screen Rant or rereading. And so let me know whether or not you like this and want to see more of it. So let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Galactic Reviews.